In the previous video, I discussed my interpretation of the story that runs through the Pagan Trilogy. However, if you haven't 30 minutes to spare, the summary of that story goes as follows. So, basically, it's about being transgender. In this video, however, we'll be reviewing the actual meat of the trilogy. The indie video game scene has always tried to emulate the styles of games from yesteryear, and the latest trend has been mimicking the PlayStation 1 and Windows 95 era of console and PC games. However, some video games fail to accurately replicate the games that they're seeking to emulate. I'll be reviewing some of the visuals and technicalities of the Pagan Trilogy as a sort of case study for a wider trend, seeing how these games accurately emulate different traits of the era, and then seeing where they fail to do so. To clarify, I am by no means a professional game developer. While I'm currently studying creative computing and have some light game development experience, please do not interpret this as me giving my expert take. I also won't be reviewing any of the code or literal technicalities of the games themselves. This game wears its Unity engine badge quite proudly. I'm simply looking at how well the game is emulating the look of old video games and how accurately the game discusses technology of the time. So have you ever heard of a compliment language? Like when you say something nice, but then you kind of say some bitchy stuff, but then you finish it off with something positive, so it kind of takes away the sting of the bitchy comment? So that's kind of how I'm going to structure this video. Long before every game on this planet took overly generous slices of your hard drive, games had a sum total of dick nuttin for storage space. PlayStation 1 discs held roughly 600 megabytes, so if you wanted to fatten up your game with extra unique content, voice lines or music, any of that extra stuff, you'd have to split your game between multiple discs. But printing multiple discs was expensive, and printing multiple cartridges just wasn't a thing, I guess. Despite the Nintendo 64 having only 64 megabytes of, there's no fucking way that Nintendo 64 had only 64, okay. that's there's no fucking way that was alright, whatever, sorry. Anyway, it was, basically, this meant that if you wanted to make a game that had any amount of length and girth, you'd have to reuse a lot of your assets, which Pagan does, liberally in fact. While emulating games of this era, it's important to not only generously reuse content, but to design levels with the mindset of, how do I design this so it has as few unique assets as possible? In the canon documentation for Plaza 96, which is the game you explore within the Pagan Trilogy, it claims that the game was played in a large, seamless virtual world. Now this advertising comment is quite funny considering the games are very heavily broken up, with different mismatched settings cut up between featureless hallways, creating an illogical space. If you're developing a retro game, try getting into the headspace of the developers of the time. Clearly these developers overestimated the tech, leading to false advertising. Try to imagine what game developers would have tried to include, then fall short, and see what those compromised features might look like. One thing I very much enjoy is that this game actually includes billboards and flat textures. I've seen an odd number of retro games that are just fully 3D, like they're just low poly, but like I've seen games that literally swap their perfectly fine 2D textures for 3D ones. But like lots of old games use flat textures in 3D spaces simply because it's easier for the system to render, and it takes up less space to have flat billboard trees rather than fully 3D ones. You see this tactic used everywhere in old games, yet modern developers seem to neglect it, despite the fact that it's still good practice. Using these optimizing tactics was common practice then, and sincerely needs to be understood and implemented into modern games. Even if you think it looks ugly, trust me, it's rarely gonna be pretty, but that's the charm you're trying to aim for. So I want to hammer home my point regarding the importance of understanding and respecting the technical limitations of older hardware. There's this Scab Lord boss in Pagan Autogeny. It's a good example of inaccurate graphics emulations. The actual creature itself isn't at fault here. Aside from being as annoying as an annoying thing, open brackets, think of something annoying to include in the script here, close brackets, the boss doesn't actually break the era aesthetic at all. It's these flying minions the Lord commands that are just ever so slightly breaking the look here. You see these things float towards the player. The whole challenge is to try and circle around and avoid these floaters while you chip away at the boss. However, these bugs are many and they have physics collision. You see them bumping into each other and floating around. Another entity does this, the featureless civilians in the first Pagan game. But like, real-time physics has been an expectation of games for like almost 2 decades, but try to get a DOS computer or PlayStation to track a few dozen floating entities with real-time collision, and like, oh my god, it would crash, probably. I mean, I don't fucking know. What, you think it would explode or something? This isn't the fucking angry video game fucking channel, you fucking... Another famous aesthetic of the era is heavy fog. I mean, really it's Silent Hill 1 that made this the look of horror games from that era, but Pagan does include fog, but its method is flawed. I was standing on a street corner and a hobo thought I was a working bro. No, that's dumb. I'm gonna cut that line. In this field, for example, it's accurate. Nice thick fog that you can't see through, but an area like this that uses filters to distort and hide distant objects isn't actually doing it correctly. Silent Hill 1 had strong fog as a band-aid fix to hide the awful render distance. Without it, you'd have to watch the game awkwardly clunk spaces in front of Mr. Mason as you wander. Including fog adds to the atmosphere, and now defines the atmosphere of the series, but its core purpose is hiding technical flaws. But the thing is, you can see through these filters that distant terrain and objects are loaded in, thus sort of defeating the purpose of the filter. Simply including the same things sometimes isn't enough. You have to know the why behind a visual feature so you know when and how to accurately include it. So something I didn't delve into in the first video were these extra archived forums that are hosted on the developer's website. They're supposed to be light documentation and some extra lore stuff for the games themselves, but there's this one section in the description of PAGAN that I thought was odd. The article claims that the game was played in a large seamless virtual world which could host hundreds of player characters or avatars simultaneously. While the DOS client was limited to a text-based interface, the Windows 95 release allowed for users to interact in full 3D, a technical marvel for the time. Honestly, I originally dismissed this as not possible, but upon further pondering, I think that while it certainly could be possible, it would be extremely tiresome. Basically, what this text is describing is that two players, one seeing only descriptions, menus, and inputs, and a player seeing a proper full 3D space like we see in the game, could be in the same location at the same time and fully interact with each other. Yeah, so this would cause an unholy amount of issues. Assuming, okay, just for example, assuming player versus player interactions are possible, a 3D player would easily be able to just rotate around a DOS player and mass click to kill them, while the DOS player would just have to watch their health bar decrease as they struggle to hit back. How you would represent data would also be difficult, since the DOS player wouldn't actually be looking at anything. Their model in-game wouldn't be able to show the direction they're looking, so they'd be probably just stuck looking forward, like looking in the direction that they're moving, flagging the fact that they're just a filthy fucking DOS player. Also, all of the bosses use ranged attacks, which is fairly easy to dodge in 3D, I mean, assuming you're not me at least, but there would be quite a struggle to respond in real time on a DOS client. Having these all sync up and not be laggy and unbalanced would be just a fucking nightmare. More realistically, a turn-based world would suit this scenario much better. But the truth is, honestly, the server does not give a flying fuck what you see. The information the server actually needs is your inputs, so it knows which direction the player is moving, if they're typing in chat, opening or closing their inventory, swinging their sword, charging their phone, being bisexual, eating hot chip, lying, that kind of thing. So as long as the server is acquiring the information it needs, it doesn't really care what is being described and how. I mean, this is why, like, someone can join a Minecraft server with, like, crazy textures, shading, all this stuff, and then someone can just join without any of those things, and they can play together, because that information isn't entirely relevant to the server. Obviously, things like anti-cheat programs might kick up more of a fuss if you're using stuff that lets you, I don't know, see through walls or input rapid or false values, but that basic relationship of a personal computer to a game server would function perfectly fine with different users using different software to play in the same instance. What the player sees is more or less irrelevant to the server. So PAGAN is supposed to be a game that's rotten and slowly decayed after being left online for so long. The word autogeny refers to the creation of life from spaces void of life, the implication being that the code has been active and updating for so long without updates or repair that it's just alive now. I have a personal headcanon about this that I excused from the first video since it wasn't really relevant. There's this thing called arbitrary code execution. To be brief for my mom in the audience, ACE is basically when the player inputs extremely precise values through gameplay actions, item or save file names. These actions, if performed exactly, can bleed into the RAM data, causing specific sections of memory addresses to flip new values. Do this correctly and you can scramble the game's memory, forcing open things like the developer console, moving the player or items, causing the game to slip the player to different locations, and many more depending on the game. This is an extremely complex technique, often deployed by speedrunners, nerds, to manipulate old games from this era without externally modifying the console or the game. So my theory is that since the game's been online for so long and is simulating such a large but vulnerable space, by just pure chance, the game's players or features have set off aces, and this has begun to snowball over time, explaining some of the more bizarre elements of the game. Certain stuff might have also been broken or was just never implemented properly in the first place. While I mentioned billboards earlier, I neglected to mention an important factor. A billboard is supposed to render facing the camera. For example, these trees in Mario need to face towards the camera to maintain the effect. This effect, for whatever reason, isn't working on these 2D huts, meaning that they're locked facing one direction, so the player can walk to their side and the object just disappears from view. There's a chance that these could also be broken level of detail models. LOD models are simply just alternative versions of models that have a way lower poly count, have less or no textures, or have any special certain effects disabled. Games still use this technique, or, at least they're supposed to, but the famous example is when Mario gets too far from the camera in Mario 64. He gets downgraded to these shovel hands models so the game can have a higher poly count budget to render the rest of the map. However, the player shouldn't notice this effect in normal gameplay. Given that this game is supposed to be played on a blurry CRT TV, that would have likely hid this change in model. In this same area, many of the enemies are large chunks of blood and have default sound effects assigned to them. What might be happening here is that, in normal gameplay, enemies would burst into chunks of flesh upon death. However, the models have been mixed up, and now the main model is the chunk of flesh one. So this could be a simple mix-up. If the body models are called goblin_B, for example, and the chunks are called goblin_C, a simple bug or corruption in gameplay could have caused these to switch. The default noises it's making could also be a fallback pain sound effect that either wasn't replaced or the one that's supposed to be here isn't being called properly for some reason. And the game has just fallen back to the fallback as opposed to falling back to the frontback. Lastly, I want to discuss combat. As I said earlier, this game and its description would have made a lot more sense as an MMORPG with turn-based combat. These games suffer a bit from floaty movement unity disease, which I can excuse because despite the fact that they're video games, the actual gameplay isn't really what you're coming for. I think I enjoy the tarot card system in Pagan. Despite it being remarkably basic, I get a simple enjoyment out of being able to equip stuff that lets me go real fast. This isn't exactly relevant to Pagan, which makes it an amazing final topic for a video about Pagan, but I think something fun about older RPGs is being able to find ways to exploit the game and get very overpowered builds. A big sense of enjoyment around something like Dark Souls, which isn't even actually that old, is making builds that just do silly stuff like tons of build-up damage or like crazy massive chain attacks or that just do tons of damage all at once. The original Fallout has this really funny exploit when gambling. Basically, if your gambling skill is at least 51% or more, you could get infinite money. Basically, the game just uses your gambling skill percent as your chance to win. So if you have 50% in gambling, your odds are 50-50. So you can just keep rolling on high and you're probably gonna win. I also realized that the dialog box can be controlled with the number keys, and the betting menu has a fourth option, but the accepting menu doesn't. So I just modified this haunted Chinese keyboard into an auto gambler that just infinitely asks to play, bets max, then loops, and left it on until I had enough money to buy literally all of the end game loot early. Now, did I ruin the challenge of the game and take away from the setting and the struggle, putting myself in a scenario where I could dominate situations designed to be difficult? Yes. Did I ruin the game for myself? Absolutely not. This was fucking amazing. I love that. I think if you're designing an old school RPG like this, while it's against your best interests to leave the game unbalanced, if you discover an exploit or a funny but broken build, and the game doesn't have a player versus player element to it, maybe, just maybe, for the funnies, you could consider turning a blind eye, right? Just leave it off for the fun. So in conclusion, I think using low poly graphics with modern technology is fine, but if you're explicitly going to mimic old styles, you have to fully commit and know what you're doing. Nobody likes a mime who slips mid-performance and not so quietly whispers fuck underneath their breath. Try to embrace all aspects of older technology styles, even elements that we know aren't particularly favourable, because it shows you honestly care about honouring the respective era, and even small, seemingly inconsequential inaccuracies can add up into a disjointed feeling piece. Anyway, yeah, no more pagan videos. I'm done. I'm done forever, actually, now, bye.
I'm trying to get coolers! What?